Hi there, my name is Grant Scanlon and we're about to line the walls and the ceiling of this new bedroom using fake tongue and groove, and we want to make it look like real boards. The room is in a house we're building onto. The house was built back in 1890, so the original walls are made from a single layer of tongue and groove boards with framing visible on one side. We're wanting to keep the traditional tongue and groove look, but building the way they did back then isn't covered by today's building code, and using real tongue and groove boards is expensive. We've already stretched the budget using real hoop pine floorboards, as there are no fake products available that have the same character as the original flooring, and they help pull off the use of fake tongue and groove on the walls and ceiling, because if one part is genuine, then it is generally assumed the rest is too. The fake tongue and groove we're using is made from MDF sheeting, which stands for medium density fibre. So it's a fibre based sheeting that has V grooves cut in it, so it looks like tongue and groove boards. Well, once they're painted, that is. Kind of. Okay, they don't quite have the same character that the real boards do, but they're close enough. Although to pull this off, we found ourselves gap filling the original boards so they look more even and the fake sheeting blends in better. Where necessary, we have used real boards where fake tongue and groove would be too obvious because it's on the same wall. The other thing is the original house had no trimming around the doors or windows. This is because real tongue and groove boards could easily be cut accurately around windows and doors, and timber mouldings back then were expensive. So this is the look we must replicate in the new part of the house if we want the fake tongue and groove to look believable. But doing this with a 1.2 metre wide sheet is a lot more difficult than you'd think, which is why modern houses have trimming around doors and windows to cover up all the gaps. Which is why we use this stuff. We've already lined part of this room a while ago with unprimed sheeting, left over from finishing another part of the house, but have some quite large gaps around this door because we weren't putting in much effort to get this accurate, not realizing how much time it takes to fill these gaps in. And priming this by hand with a brush takes even more time, and unprimed sheeting soaks paint up like it's going out of fashion. We tried using a roller to speed things up, but it wouldn't get into the grooves properly. So a brush it was, and we had to do 2 coats of primer undercoat before we could do the top coat. To save time painting, we'll be using pre-primed sheeting and spend a bit more time fitting it around doors and windows neatly to save ourselves doing a lot of filling. We'll start by measuring this wall so we can work out how to place our sheets. This wall is around 3.6 meters wide, so 3 sheets will fit on it neatly. We spaced the studs 600 millimeters apart so the joins in the sheeting would line up with the studs, although this isn't that critical because the sheets have a grooved edge with a plastic tongue, so they will be flush with each other even if the join isn't on a stud. Although it's easier to line the groove up with the tongue if it's on a stud because the stud helps guide it in. I think the best place to start is the sheet that is the most difficult to cut around doors and windows, because then you're not restricted so much by the sheets that join onto it. In this wall, this would be the end sheet because it has to cut around this doorway. Right, looking at this front wall, the first sheet's going to come to there, the second sheet will come to there. So this window needs to be cut out from the second sheet, making this sheet more difficult to cut than that one. Now, looking at this wall, the first sheet comes to here, so needs to be cut out for this window. The next sheet comes to here, so has to be cut out for two windows. So it is the most difficult sheet, because this sheet only has that half a window, this sheet nothing, and neither does that one. So that's the winner. That's the most difficult sheet of them all. It's easier to mark and cut the sheets as close as possible to where they'll be installed and be at a comfortable height rather than crawling about on the floor, something a guy my age would rather not be doing, which is why we've set up a couple of trestles in the room we're working in to place the sheets on. This way we can take measurements and mark the sheet right there and then, starting with the right hand window, then moving on to the left hand window, allowing a gap at the top that will be covered by scotia, so the cuts around the windows can be made more accurate, reducing the amount of gap filling needed here. We also need to measure the height of the wall and once again leave a gap at the bottom that will be covered by skirting boards. We can then cut the sheet to length. This cut doesn't need to be particularly straight because it will be covered up by those skirting boards, so we can just cut it by hand with an electric circular saw, commonly known as a skill saw, although we prefer a Makita. With the cuts around the windows, we would like to be more accurate and straight, so we clamp a cutting guide onto the sheet that is a fixed distance from our marked line. We use the same Makita saw as before, but this time it is pushed against the guide, so the cuts are straight and more accurate. We cut the bottom of the left hand window first, but not the bottom of the right, because it is at a slightly different height. Care taken not to go too far, otherwise we have a saw cut to fill in. We then move the guide to the top of the left hand window and cut this. Then adjust the guide for the top of the right hand window that is not only at a different height, but we'll be cutting this from the other side of the guide because we're on the other side of the sheet. Same goes for the bottom of the right hand window. For the vertical cuts, we need a longer guide, so use a length of aluminium box section we happen to have that was long enough and clamp this to the sheet. This is a difficult cut because it doesn't start from the edge of the sheet and we need to plunge the saw in. We then move the guide and do the vertical cut for the right hand window. The guide is then removed and an electric jigsaw used to finish the cut so they are square into the corners. Now to see if the sheet fits. Of course it doesn't, so we need to get on the ladder and work out what's not fitting. It appears the bottom of the right hand window is a little high, so we remark this, and because we're ready to start cursing loudly at this point, rather than put the sheet back on the trestles and set up the guides etc., we choose to just trim it where it is with the cordless saw. So much for getting a nice straight and accurate cut here. There's only so much effort a man can put in. Even so, the gaps aren't too bad. There are a few missed plunge cuts, mind you, but oh well. Which is why we use this stuff. We then use an air-powered bradding gun to fix the sheet to the wall. Brads seem to hold MDF sheeting very well, are quick to fit and only make a very small hole to fill in later on, as opposed to screws or larger nails that require a lot more filling.
Now, for the second sheet, we'll do this one, which requires one cutout for the window. It needs to be trimmed to fit into the corner. It should be plumb, but we never know about the distances. And we have a power outlet that needs a hole.
Onto the second sheet, we measure up and mark the window as before, starting with the top, allowing a 5mm clearance from the ceiling, and then the bottom, making sure we've cut enough off this time. Then the width of the sheet, top and bottom, so we can cut into the corner and no, it wasn't plumb. Then the length of the sheet, and then we cut it all up, much the same as we did before, although we didn't bother with the guides this time. Now onto the hole for that power outlet.
Right, now in Australia, we just cut a hole in the sheet for the power outlet and put in one of these little D brackets. So the hole could go anywhere in the sheet really, but we prefer to keep it near the edge so that it doesn't sort of flex when you pull the power point in and out. I want this power outlet to come out about here, so I need to measure the edge of that sheet. So on the sheet itself, we want the power outlet to be, that's where the stud lines up. So we want this little bracket to fit just off the edge of that, about 300 from the ground. So ideally, we want a hole that's there that goes across to there or so, and it's that deep. Screws will be there. Screws will be there. Top of the hole. Right to that edge. We can then cut it out with this little cordless saw. And then finish it with the jigsaw. And that bracket squeezes up in behind there. It sits that way on there. And the power outlet goes on top. Nice and neat.
Now to the fitting of that second sheet, and once again it doesn't fit. So up the ladder we go, and once again the issue is with the bottom of the window that is too high and needs to be trimmed with the small cordless saw. What would we do without that little saw? We also need to poke the wires through for that power outlet. We can't forget those. The next challenge is getting the groove of one sheet to fit into the tongue of the other, which isn't that easy because the sheet flexes a bit. You've got to get it in at the bottom first and work your way up, and then before it jumps out, quickly get that brad nailer into action to hold it in place. Then you can nail the rest of the sheet off. Starting with the edges first, then working our way into the middle. We measure from the edge of the sheet to find the position of the stud, and from the floor to find the position of the noggins. Sometimes it takes several brads until we find solid wood. We then fitted the third sheet, which is much the same process as the second, including a hole for a second power outlet, and another hole for a network socket as well. This sheet doesn't fit into the corner. This is saved for the fourth sheet. Then we filled in that last bit from the unprimed wall. Then we completed the front wall, starting with the middle sheet because it cuts around most of the window. Then the next sheet needs only a small cut so it can be lined up with the first more easily than if it was done the other way around. Once again, the last sheet needs only to be fitted into the corner. Then on the next wall, we started with the sheet that had to be cut around the door, so the next sheet would be easier to line up, and the last sheet trimmed into the corner. Completing the illusion of real boards is now down to the gap filling and painting. But before we get into this, we must first align the ceiling, which is a job and a half on its own. Too much for one video, so we'll be covering this in a second video, along with the gap filling, painting and finishing the room off in general. So we'll see you there.